within that, it's expected that they declare a planetary emergency. A planetary emergency. Of what kind or form? It's almost implied that it's this like totality of this concept of permacrisis or polycrisis. We're going to wrap them all up in one.
Hello and welcome to the Resistance Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dan Astin-Gregory from Free Humanity.
Great to be here.
Dan, do you want to give us a little bit of background about you?
Gosh, how far do you want me to go back?
Well, we don't need to know, date
First
of birth
I was born,
or anything.
yes, okay.
You were born. I mean, that's a good first step.
Yeah, I'm 40, so a 1983 baby. There we go.
When was it you first woke up to what was going on in our society?
Well, to the depths of what's happening has probably been the last 5 to 10 years, probably the last 5 really seriously. But even that's funny that we started going back to 1983, because actually when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I remember coming home. My dad would always come home from work and put the TV on and grab a newspaper. So he was always immersed in what was going on in the world, local news, national news, international news. And I remember one day he was just watching TV and there was these grey-haired guys jeering at each other across these green leather benches. And I said, what's going on there? And he said, son, that's Parliament. That's our government. This is how our country is run. And my head as a small child was like, that's interesting. That's odd. They're just like jeering at each other and shouting. I thought, this is how the country's run. So I've always been skeptical of government. Then in my teenage years, I got into kind of punk rock and, and weirdly now in the day and age we live in now, punk rock doesn't seem to exist in the way that it did. But that gave me a real sense of anti-establishment in a way and a rebellious spirit. But I've always been deeply curious. So when COVID hit, that was when the alarm bell started firing for me.
What was the thing that really knocked off that main alarm bell?
Well, firstly, it was super early, January 2020, when you saw those bodies in the street in China, like flat out, like just sprawled like a crash test dummy. And interestingly enough, I actually have a friend who's an actor who does stunt work. And he told me, when you look at those bodies, that's not how humans fall when they die. Because he knows, because he's had to study that in order to kind of try and replicate it as an actor. He said, I can tell you categorically, those aren't dead bodies. They're actors who are pretending to be dead. So that was one of the very first early warning signs that something was astray. But then I really started to follow the data quite early on. And selfishly, I was going to Thailand for my... Not selfishly, it's not selfish to go to Thailand, or is it selfish to have a honeymoon? That's what I was going to do.
I don't know, it depends what you're doing in Thailand.
Well, yeah, so I was going there for my honeymoon. So I was worried that this thing would hijack our honeymoon plans that we'd spent all this time getting really excited for. And luckily it didn't, but I was paying increasing attention as a result of that. And I was looking at all this data. I was like, oh, well, this just looks like a flu to me. It's the elderly people are getting sick or dying. Most of them have like 4 or 5 different comorbidities. I thought this thing is it's just like a bad flu season. And from there on, the narratives just kept growing and growing and growing. I thought, what's going on here? So that there was a void between the actual truth, the reality, and the perception of the truth. And the bigger that gap got, the more and more concerned I became for what was going to happen. And then the moment they locked us down, I thought, this has gone too far. So I spent almost every spare moment of my time trying to make sense of what's happening. I didn't start a podcast then. I later started a podcast in August by accident, really, because I just did a live video that went viral and like 1 million people watched it in the space of a week. I was like, oh gosh, I'm not the only one that feels like this, which is quite nice to know. And I thought, how do I follow this? So I ended up doing starting a podcast, the Pandemic Podcast, did 1,000 episodes later, 25 million plus views or whatnot. But people clearly resonated with the fact that there was a problem here and that we need to make sense of it. So that's what I spent every single day doing for the last 4 years. It hasn't really changed.
I know, it's weird how you sort of fall into it.
Yeah.
Because I remember at the start of everything, I was just looking into, like our constitution, because I went, you're locking up people where judge, jury, trial.
Yep.
That's against the fundamental tenets of English law. These are like the foundations of our constitution. You can't abolish them because you're meant to be sort of created out of those elements.
Absolutely.
It's like the Sir Edward Coke said, it would be, I think it would like repugnant essentially
Yeah.
to make a man a judge in his own case. If you tried to do that, you say, okay, well, you can judge yourself. No, that's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it can never be done. Even if Parliament said, okay, well, that's fine. You couldn't do it. If Parliament tried to say tomorrow that, yes, rape, murder are okay, you'd still have the right to go to a court, even if there's not statute on the books, and claim under the common law you have suffered some sort of injury. And you say this person's committed a crime because they've committed some sort of injury against me. Because it would just be eminently establishable in the court.
Yeah. Well, that's why I kind of got excited that when Simon Dolan came along with his legal case.
Me too.
And I thought, oh, someone else is making sense, and not only making sense, they have the money and the resources to go and do something legally about this. Oh, this is good news.
Like a billionaire or a multi-millionaire,
yeah.
And you think, okay, maybe this is like the sort of Batman who's going to come in and save us.
The brand they came up with is Keep Britain Free. I was like, that's very clever. It's like Keep Britain Tidy. It's like a very bit of clever marketing. So we've got some smart people behind this. They kept taking it to. And then I heard Francis Hall speak for the first time. I thought, wow, there's some good legal might here. There's some really good ideas. And then, of course, that fell flat on its face.
Well, I was at the last appeal of that. So that is actually the day that I started all of this.
Wow.
Because I'd been down to the protests and it was just disgusting what I saw from the police. And then the media was reporting, public attack police, right? And I saw the police attack the public. I saw that it was a peaceful protest. I knew this was one of our rights. When I went down to that court case, there were only about 8 people there in the public gallery. And there was Louise Creffield from Keep Britain Free. There were a couple of people from the newspapers. There's one guy who was like a friend of Simon Dolan because he wasn't there himself because he was off in Monaco.
That's right.
And I was thinking,
what's going on?
I was number 8.
Yes.
I was number 8 in that room. And I was just a guy who was just so intrigued and interested and furious at what was happening. I wanted to hear for myself what they were saying. And the judge, the so-called Lord Chief Justice of England, he said that he said, what we've seen in the Times newspaper. That was his focus. His focus was on the media and what he'd seen in the newspaper that he read, rather than the evidence that was being presented. And Francis Hall, the barrister, he was the junior barrister, though. I felt the senior barrister was weak. Right. Weak. Because, when he talks about public law is what they call constitutional law. When they put that across, it was like, oh, and if there's some sort of principle, it was like you were sort of reaching for something, but you didn't really have that constitutional knowledge. I've had Graham Moore in here, who is excellent. There are things that we disagree on, right? But his knowledge of constitutional law is great. And he says, I've got the old exams. I've got all of the cheat sheets they used to have before their bar exams, and then they've removed it from the exams. So the lawyers are no longer taught this. So if they want to go and try and articulate an argument about the fundamental limits of government power, the only way they can actually do that in the modern day, because they haven't been taught it, is through something like the ECHR. Right. Or the European Union, or an appeal to the Human Rights Act. They don't appeal to these fundamental principles of English law. They've existed for hundreds of years, and they don't read the books. The books are all out of print. Yeah. Man, Graham told me, go get this book. I look it up. One copy on the internet, £500. Yep. Pass. How many lawyers have even studied them? So
crazy. Yeah, I mean, that is crazy, and it taught me to not get my hopes up about the legal system from there forth, because it wasn't just that's a very fair point about the kind of defense, but actually the argument was essentially made that these are emergency situations and therefore that has precedence, and that has been a cycle that we've witnessed throughout history, where emergency powers can be justified based upon whatever is perceived to be the emergency. And I think that's the kind of culture we're living in. However, the benefit, and it's fascinating to see that's where you started all of this, the benefit of what happened there is obviously that it forced transparency within the SAGE group. And that's at least something. And that started something, actually, because without that, we had no visibility whatsoever. So as an interesting side effect, and that also taught me there's never a loss there is sometimes a marginal gain that can actually be a wedge that can be driven open. Because if we'd had complete lack of transparency across that, we wouldn't have learned that the group was formed primarily of behavioral scientists. There was very little presence of a very holistic committee. So it gave us a very clear view that the game was set up in a way that was going to be played that we probably wouldn't have seen until much later or even after if it hadn't been for that case.
I actually know a woman who was asked to be on stage.
Right.
She looked at what they were doing. She went, "This is what I've spent my entire life, fighting against, because this is against every single bit of our ethics." And so she rejected a membership on this Sage Council.
Well, I interviewed someone who was a member of Sage throughout COVID. I can't say his name, but he was a dissenting voice within that environment. I pledged that I would. It's never been published. It's not an interview that we recorded. It was not. It was a private conversation, and it gave me a real view of the groupthink in particular. And he was careful what he said because he knew that my job was to tell stories, report what was happening. But he gave me a very clear view that this was deep groupthink. There was and the power dynamics within the group, very interesting, he described. It was very authoritarian even inside the group. And Neil Ferguson had a lot of clout in that group early on. And there was, there's almost like this religiosity around it, that this message of the science started to really emerge early on. Yet there was very few actual space for scientific debate. So I got a little bit of a view, and he actually ended up leaving himself as well, alongside several others later on. But it's just balmy looking back to see that was the beginning, really at the beginning. At that stage, we'd been through the first lockdown, and then we had 2.5 years of more and more madness that just continued to unfold and continues to unfold really in a different form today.
So this chap who was on stage, can you tell me anything more about what he said? Obviously don't identify him.
I mean, it wasn't recorded. I'll have my notebook. I have to find that. I should have, if I knew we were going to talk about it, I'd have read my notes, but I can't remember specifics, and that's genuine. I really can't remember the specifics. It was more about the structure. He spoke about the structure and the way that the group didn't allow for dissenting voices. It didn't permit challenging of the science, and it was all about those models. And there was no critique of those models. There was no challenging the assumptions that went into those models. And there was no room for holistic consideration, meaning, it's all about this data, and it's not about the social science. It's not about public health. It's not about it was this myopic view of cases, deaths, which we know was the narrative for the day. There was no room for the impact on our psychology, our mental health, our emotions, our structures, our children. There was no room for discussion on any of that.
And there was no analysis as to what it would do in terms of having a democracy.
That's right.
In terms of fundamental rights, because people don't understand. You can't abolish protest. You can't abolish people's right to assemble, because then you've abolished any concept of having democracy whatsoever.
The right to protest and freedom of assembly, to me, is like the last bastion of free speech and democracy. Without those two elements, then you have tyranny. You really do. And both of those have been under threat in the last few years and continue to be under threat even to this day. And it's a rocky road that we're in. But that was a real problem. That was not a part of the Sage meeting. It wasn't about our democratic rights. It wasn't about our... despite the fact we haven't got a written constitution, there was no discussion of those fundamental rights.
We do have a written constitution. It's just not. There are a lot of things implied, and it's written across a lot of different places.
It's not a singular document.
Yes, it's not codified. So codified is meant to be in one single place. This is our constitution right here. Whereas we've got the Bill of Rights.
It's a multitude of documents strung together loosely, and I've had some really interesting conversations on that point with various different people about should we have a single, and the consensus, the broader consensus. It's not been a complete consensus. Has been that actually what we've got now is favourable, and I'm still grappling with that idea, because there's part of me that kind of wants to see some sort of, in the face of what we've just seen, a reaffirmation of our fundamental rights and freedoms, so, particularly in the way that they continue to be challenged and chipped away at and eroded. But certainly the very basis of what we're facing now, I think we do need to see a strengthening of what's in place, or a reminder of what our foundations are, because our politicians don't seem to, well, as you said, if the textbooks aren't even available for the lawyers, then it's not something that's being taught. It's not something that's even in part of the dialogue. It's not part of the conversation. It's not part of the national conversation. And we still live in this period of time where it's the word of the year in 2022, I think, was permacrisis, which means this permanent state of crisis or polycrisis. It was one of the two. And under this, and by the way, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the UN Summit of the Future that's happening in September.
Tell me.
Well, where to start with that one? So this has been in the work for a while. It's part of the reason why Free Humanity is now accelerating towards that project, because the UN is gathering in September for this Summit of the Future, where they're going to be signing a pact for the future, and within that, it's expected that they declare a planetary emergency. A planetary emergency. Of what kind of form? It's almost implied that it's this like totality of this concept of permacrisis or polycrisis. We're going to wrap them all up in one and call it a planetary emergency. The planet's on fire. The people between the society is on fire. But the problem with any of these things, as we saw during COVID, is the moment you create the perception of emergency, you create a giant wedge for authoritarianism, for tyranny, for centralization, for the obliteration of the fundamental rights, for the obliteration of freedoms. And that, for me, is a deeply concerning concept. I wanted to bring that up there because it's this idea of permanent crisis means that people are now in this perpetual sense of anxiety about the state of reality. There's no storyline. There's no narrative about a bright future or an optimistic future. We've lost that. So now we live under this like perma crisis. And as a result, the mechanisms that we've seen during COVID are always available. And we're seeing them now. There's riots in the street, and I don't condone violence, but at the same time, I definitely do not condone the use of facial recognition, broad stroke, just to treat everyone as evil, as everyone as a suspect.
Personally, after just the sheer criminality of the police, the fact they are just a criminal mafia. Honestly, I couldn't care less if people burn police vans. I'm not telling people to. I just don't care. It's like, things happen in the world, bad things happen, right? But if bad things happen to bad people, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to shed any tears over it.
Well, I understand the sentiment. I suppose for me personally, I'm looking at do not become what you are resisting. And they have used violence on us in multiple forms. And, our experience firsthand in Geneva, just this last couple of months, we went to Geneva for the Road to Geneva to challenge this pandemic treaty and the amendments. And, there's a lot of discussion around sovereignty and the impact of these things on sovereignty. And the WHO kept referring to their documents saying, well, look, in our documents, we're clearly stating that we're preserving your sovereignty. And that in itself is a form of gaslighting and abuse, because it doesn't need to have a form of hard power, meaning written legislation. Soft power is as powerful as hard powerful. Soft power encompasses propaganda, it encompasses coercion.
Looking at it from an outside point of view, the World Economic Forum should have zero power, because it is not it's not a government. It is not a government in any part of the world.
Yes.
But Majid Nawaz was the one who called it the sort of soft palace coup.
That's right.
When they started signing these deals with the UN that now brought them officially into the UN
so it does bring hard power into it.
So, yeah, that sort of legitimizes them. Now they are associated or affiliated or in partnership with the UN, who have their own armed forces.
Yes.
Now, the World Economic Forum de facto has an army at its disposal because they've signed their accord of partnership, which I think is terrifying. This should be some random outside group. Like, I know you worked with the Together campaign.
Yes.
Together goes round. I'm not sure if you're still with Together or
no, just a supporter now.
Yeah, just a supporter now. But you did a lot of work with them, which was great.
Is one of the co-founders. Yeah, got it off the ground.
Yeah. You go out, you lobby people, you encourage people to do this and that and the other, right? But the power of the World Economic Forum, like you should be on a sort of equal playing field. They've got their opinion, they argue for it. You've got your opinion, you argue for it. But their power.
Yeah, I think a lot of the problems we're facing right now is actually the fact that there is this concentration of power, and that's another concern I have for the UN Summit of the Future, because they're bringing together not only nation states, but of course the same corporate partners that have kind of shaped the ideology or the worldview that we're operating under right now. I see it as what we're going through is like multiple layers, and one is like a worldview. It's almost like a guiding philosophy of how we operate, and this is highly shaped by these organizations. And they talk about we work with civil society, yeah, but civil society organizations that represent the viewpoints that you want to be represented. They talked about this is the most democratic engagement that we've ever had. We've did a consultation of 1.5 million people. Yeah, and you're supposed to represent the planet. What, 8+ billion people? That's like tiniest minutia of a fraction. Like it's not even close to being representative.
And also, it depends what question.
Oh,
you
of
ask,
course.
doesn't it?
And what you even do with it. You know, we've seen every consultation that British Parliament put out. What happens with it? You know, they just kick it down the road. It's it's a bureaucratic exercise. It's a tick in a box. You're going to do what you want anyway.
I mean, you could say to people, "Oh, do you want this road to be completely relayed?" And people say yes. But then if you say, "Do you want to pay extra taxes for the road to be relayed?" and everyone goes, "No, do you know what? I'll put it. Yeah, it's okay. I'd love a fresh road, right? There are a couple of potholes, more usually now, but they put up with it. No one wants to pay that extra money.
That's right.
It's all in how you phrase the question.
It is. But you also frame a different problem there, and a separate problem to that, which is we're always presented with a choice between one evil and the lesser of two evils. It's not like because those two aren't the only options.
Well, look at Ukraine and Russia, right? Oh, are you a Zelensky supporter or a Putin supporter?
Do you support tyrant A or tyrant B? You know, it's like
neither. And then it's either the Gazan government, right,
Same
or
problem.
the Israeli government. I'm like, well, both of them are criminal entities.
Terrorists? No thanks.
Terrorists.
Yep.
Done. No, not having it.
Yep. Why aren't you waving their flag? Well, because I don't support the terrorists that's in charge.
And then so you're on our side, and it's like, if you're supporting one of these factions, you are supporting the terrorists.
Exactly. People, and I mean, you've opened a can of worms on that, because that one is that is a very, very divisive topic. All of those people can't see. What frustrates me about that topic in particular, and the topic that the kind of topics that surround that, is during COVID, I think people came across from all spectrum of the political realm. And even though the freedom movement was attempted to be billed as like this far right fringe movement, that's the flavor of the month, calling out far right.
And the truth is that, people try and describe the Nazis as far right. And the idea is, being far right, you be a Nazi. The Nazis were far left.
Well, they conflate nationalism with being far right, which is actually, nationalism can actually operate within the context of an authoritarian far left socialist regime.
Well, the Nazis, I wouldn't call them nationalists; they were racialists, right?
Right.
So
it's ethnic.
So they call it nationalists,
Yes.
right? But they're happy to eliminate people who may be completely German because they don't have the racialist attributes that they have. It's a very sort of far left collectivism, because they were the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Yes.
Right? You got socialists in there. You got Workers' Party in there.
Yes.
Who was it? National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterparty. Right?
Yes.
Oh my God! You should have seen the kids' faces at Hope when I said, "Oh, so who knows what Nazi means?" They went, because no one's ever taught it.
That's right.
And I think, do you know what? I think genuinely that's one of the greatest historical coups that they've pulled off. That most people, when you walk down the street, can't even tell you it's a Nazi. They can't even tell you what it stands for.
Yes, but you make a good point, actually, because it's not just because it is a national socialism, but it's not nationalism. It's ethnic nationalism. They're two very different things.
Racial,
racial.
You might even say Aryanist.
Yes,
socialism. Because Aryanism is essentially their sort of religion, sort of like a sort of Gnostic Aryanism.
Yes.
Because but then again, this concept of an Aryan race is pretty, silly.
Crazy.
I mean, obviously you've got the it's Proto-Indo-Europeans, and you've got the Aryan people of the Iran, right, is actually where the Aryan people. That's where the name of the country comes from. Yeah, which is strange. He's just naming himself after a bunch of Persians.
Yeah, I mean, we could go into I digress into a whole range of discussions about kind of the current state of affairs. I had a microbiome test recently because I have a history of autoimmune conditions, and as part of that, it tests your DNA, and it gives you this genetic breakdown of your kind of ethnohistory. And it breaks down what percentage of your DNA is from different parts of the world. And we live in this time where kind of people are talking about what's foreign. I'm like, well, check your DNA. What really is foreign? Because humanity has never stayed in one place. Our history, our cultures move around. It's a fascinating discussion, and I'm aware that even entering into that dialogue is risky territory, but I think it's important to recognize who is really native to an area truly. You might get you know, certain pockets where it's like your families throughout their history have stayed in one area, one community, and therefore your DNA may have a different lineage. But it's really, I was fascinated. I was like, well, I'm actually not surprised. I'm redheaded, very pale. You know, there's Nordic in me, there's Scottish in me. I should have guessed that from my surname, Gregory. You know, Astin-Gregory is because I got married. We double-barreled. And that was just a really interesting experience when you start to see how people are fighting amongst each other over things where we have this really short life and this really tiny little rock in this giant universe. I'm like, as I watch my son play with other children and see them grappling and kind of tussling for, you know, toys, I'm like, as an adult, I'm starting to learn about how conflict can be managed in a really healthy way just by through my children. At what point do we lose sight of that and it becomes... Well, I suppose that's what creates the space for authoritarianism in a way. It creates the space for some, because that's what your child does. Is, you know, I saw it this morning, literally this morning, grappling with a friend, and he wanted the toy, and the girl took it, and of course he comes to daddy saying, "Daddy, Daddy, I want the toy back," and what he wants me to do is steal it back. And I said, "Well, she's got it now. She let it. I mean, she hadn't stolen it. She was playing with it. He just wanted to play with it." I said, "Look, you play with it. Let her play with the toy because she can have the fun. Because I could easily go and say, well, you hand it over now and let Zach have a turn. But actually, that just teaches the person that they don't have they can't finish their fun. They always have to have their fun curtailed. It's like, well, you can have all of your fun, and then you can have your fun too. And but what the child is looking for is the adult to come and step in." And of course, children kind of need that guidance. But as adults now, we're in this situation where in the face of a crisis or in the face of uncertainty, that's exactly what people do. They still look to mum and dad, but they look to the government as mum and dad. And we have this really kind of paternal, maternal relationship with the state, or I say we, the collective we. And that, for me, is part of the problem that we're facing today, is we haven't really evolved into this space, whereas adults, we have the capacity to negotiate between ourselves without having to look outside ourselves for outside intervention. We've lost the ability in our communities to actually properly assess a situation and deal with it.
Well, it's a sort of infantilization,
Yeah.
whereas our ancestors were far more adult than even we are, and we like to think we're more sensible than most people. Right, we haven't followed along with all of this madness and hysteria, but our ancestors were very sensible in many ways because we didn't have all of this government and we didn't need all of this government. We resolved things ourselves. I mean, have you read the Lord of the Rings?
I haven't, no.
Have you seen the Lord?
No,
of the
I've missed out on a whole segment of humanity.
Oh my God! Have you? So, what Tolkien wrote about in the Lord of the Rings was the Shire, and the Shire was meant to represent England. Right, England with very little government. They've got maybe a night watchman. They've got an honorary Thane of the Tooks. But the idea is they have next to no government. They resolve their problems amongst themselves, right? Because it's essentially a libertarian sort of super state, or not even really a state. Just this libertarian paradise.
It's voluntarism.
Which is what the Shire is, and people take care of their homes and everything out of pride. But the minute you introduce this sort of collective element, everything starts to fall apart, and that's what you sort of get from Mordor, like this complete top-down control and this like will to power, which you can say is an application of the One Ring. The One Ring, you can't use it for good. People always are lusting after this government control, and it's do you ever get disheartened by sometimes in the freedom movement you find people and they say, yes, the government's completely wrong. I just need power, and then when I have power, it's all going to be fine.
Yep.
You go, no, you're not getting it. Like we need to move.
Tyrant A for Tyrant B all over again.
Yeah, we need to move to the true far right, which is towards libertarianism, towards actually like the breakdown of the state and just going back to individual communities.
Yeah, well, I don't even see it on that parrot. I don't need right and left. I think is not even a function of the conversation. It's like authoritarian or libertarian. They're on a political compass. They're different aspects. To me, authoritarian is a style of governance which requires rules, regulations, whereas libertarianism actually requires voluntarism. It requires strong moral and ethical principles and values which are difficult to codify, which is where it comes back to that conversation about constitution again, because when you start to codify things, then you do start to move up the authoritarianism scale. And that's what happens is with freedom, is if you don't take the responsibility that comes with it, the exception starts to become the rule, because people break the trust that is created, a social contract, if you like, between people. If one person then steals or defaces someone's property or vandalizes, then all of a sudden the community starts to say, well, we can't let that happen again. Or in fact, it's a one-off. Let's see what happens again. Then it happens again. It happens again. So that's when people start creating rules to say, well, if this, then that. So if that happens, then we're going to do this. And all of a sudden, inch by inch, the more you actually let go of the responsibility.
You need people to administrate every single level, and then they need people, and it becomes this hydra, and you try and cut it down, and it grows back. I mean, even Margaret Thatcher, who's meant to be the great, slasher of government and cutter of the state, in some ways, she definitely completely transformed the country, right? For the benefit, right? The economy came back. But in other ways, you had this slow and subtle growth of the bureaucracy. She was railing against it, but it was growing, and it kept growing. And then after she was gone, it just went
skyrocketed.
Completely
create the foundation for that to happen.
Control. And you've got to criticize Margaret Thatcher for not actually having cut that as much as she could have cut. She has cut back elsewhere, and it's unfortunate, I think.
I think under these circumstances, the challenge we're in now, particularly in reference to this UN Summit of the Future as well, that is about building UN 2.0, in their own words. They're trying to amalgamate towards Agenda 2030. They're looking to kind of re-engage their partners, both political, national, and economic corporate partners around this common pact, this common agenda. They actually call it the common agenda. Quite frankly, people say that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Well, I know it sounds like one, but that's actually what it's called. It's called the common agenda and the pact for the future, which these governments are supposedly going to sign. And again, it's not going to be legally binding over certain jurisdiction, but it creates a tide, a flow within the tide. It creates a wave that then does lead to other laws and regulations, and it creates an ethos that the governments kind of move towards. But this is all under this ever increasing, under this perma-crisis culture, this centralization of power. And I think that is where we've got to be really concerned, particularly where it starts to blur between institutional power and the merger of corporate power, as you talked about with the WEF and the UN.
Have you met Charles Mallett from UK Column?
No.
He's an ex-police officer, and he quit over the lockdowns, and now he does fantastic work with them. But he actually said that, in his opinion, not only you've got the sort of illegality with the lockdowns, etc., but he said it was an operational decision by the chief constable as whether to enforce, right? Because they're not going around enforcing some things on the books from the 1800s or 1700s or earlier. They have choice. They have discretion. Name me a police force that didn't go with it. Mm-hmm. There will just be this ridiculous pressure which will increase and increase, and they will say, "Oh well, we have to follow this." It's just like the way that sort of schools. You can't even hug a kid in a school, right? So if there's this little kid who's falling over and they're bawling their eyes out and they're quite upset, you can't give them a hug.
Yeah,
it's mad. It's absolute madness because you hug that kid and suddenly you're a nonce.
Well, I haven't been to London for a while. I was on the tube on the way here, and it said something about report it if someone is staring at you sexually. I'm like, staring? Like what? So now there's this subjective, I just caught your eye for a second too long, and now it's sexualized and it's a problem. I'm like, what? I can't even look at someone now, let alone we've gone from not being able to touch people to be able to even look at people.
Yes, I mean, how long is your eyes down?
Keep your eyes down. Don't touch anyone. Man alive. I mean, it's been like that in London for a long time. Every time I come to visit, everyone keeps their head down and their eyes closed anyway. I mean, it's just
and you packed in sardines as well.
I don't know how
you meant not to be touch anyone.
Dehumanizing experience, not having human contact and not having eye contact, for fear of, because that's what it creates fear. It's if I can't look at you for too long, if I look at you and smile, it can now can be deemed as a sex crime. And we've got pre-crimes, thought crimes, and it's all these different things. All of these things only are possible in the conditions that we are facing right now, which is why my belief is, because people always say, well, you guys, painting a pretty bleak picture. It's well, the good news is the power to shift it is in our hands as well. It's quite challenging when you get to this really global centralization of power. We've never had it in the way that we've had it today. We've never seen it before like this, because, you know, as society has become more globalized and digitally connected, etc., travel has become easier. We've never had it where the world is so interconnected. We've never had it like we have it today. So we haven't ever been through that cycle. But you can look at similar cycles at local levels, regional levels, national levels, you know, across continents, and recognize the problem.
Well, yeah, you see the Soviet Union, you see Nazi Germany, you see communist China, and people look at the fall of the Roman Empire, the complete debasement of the currency, the mass migration.
Yeah, you don't have to go to the nth degree for it to come and collapse. But my fear is under the kind of world that we live in right now, where it's so easy to sway people's opinion and to make them feel a certain way, that you can create the conditions for true, you know, centralized global governance or government. I think we're a way off that type of thing, but you know, there's things that are resembling that start of global government. In fact, there's a World Government Summit every year, you know, so it's not like it's not in the realm of consciousness of people. So when it comes to how do we climb down from that, that's a much more difficult equation. But it starts with coming back to home, and in fact, someone said to me yesterday, the greatest form of localization is within your own heart. And I was like, wow, that's profound. You know, it's like, how do you shift within you? Because your point, if only we just got these political leaders out and we have this person in, it's like you create tyrant A versus tyrant B problems until you confront the human condition, which I've been reading about a lot, because I'm trying to understand, where does that proclivity towards power and control come from? What are the circumstances that lead to it? What is it about the human condition that creates that? What is it about this, the fabric of society and social structures create that?
Have you ever read On Killing?
No.
So they did studies, I believe it was after the First World War, and they looked at soldiers who would just, you know, shoot to kill anything, essentially, you know, the people who seemed like they're a screw loose, essentially. And they found, I think it was about 2% of people who were psychopaths.
Wow. Yeah.
And because they had all of these men, all of this data, it might be in the Second World War, I might be wrong. And then they also found that about 2% of people were essentially empaths, right? They were the people who would go and jump on a grenade for someone else, right? But that was very rare. It's still about 2% of people. Whereas 96% of people in the middle aren't people who will just feel this compulsion to do the right thing. They're not people who will just want to go out and destroy and feel this absolute compulsion to do the wrong thing. Unfortunately, 96% of people, in my opinion, are sociopaths.
Okay.
Because
how did you get? So you to me, it sounds like a normal distribution curve. So you've got like the bell curve with the two edges which you've outlined. You've got the empath and you've got the psychopath. But it does mean that on both sides of that, you're going to have a level of people that gravitate to either side of that. But you would have thought the normal distribution would be that there's somewhere in the middle that is outside of that sociopathic.
Yes, but I would say, I think there's a clear differentiation between psychopath and sociopath. So yes. A psychopath, they are sort of born into this psychopathy, essentially.
Yes.
Whereas a sociopath is someone who is socially conditioned to pick that up. And what I see as dangerous in amongst the human race, and this is what truly sort of scares me when I go to sleep at night, is the fact that most people, given just the right inputs, right, given, you know, the right level of propaganda, you know, maybe they don't fall for one issue, maybe they, you know, they are opposed to lockdown, but then they fall for Ukraine, right? Maybe they, you know, see what's going on with central banking, but then they just believe that more government is the issue somewhere else. 96% of people can be tricked. Okay, given the right circumstances, they will go down a path that will lead you to you being, you know, shot, right, or herded into some gas chamber or put into some gulag to starve to death.
Yeah.
Right? That terrifies me, because that is 96% of people, and all they need to do is keep introducing. I mean, Raw Milk Conspiracy, they've got a new song called "The New Thing," right?
Yeah.
And it's you know, I'm into global warming. Oh no, now I don't mispronoun me, right? And it's like, oh, I've got to have you know, Senegalese vegan cheese, right? There's always a new thing to divide people, so they keep introducing new things, and what happens is this fairly homogenous block in a way that was the British public becomes very, very, very divided. Yeah, completely fragmented upon all of these different issues. And they can't unite. They can't fight back. And they will, some people go down the global warming route, and that's why they've got to have all of this tyranny. Other people, it's the health emergency, that's why they've got to do this tyranny. Other people, we've got to have more government because there's going to be loads of terrorism. So obviously in America, the Patriot Act, here the Terrorism Act, which they've just used to go after Tommy Robinson and tell him he doesn't have the right to remain silent. In his own interview, you don't have the right to remain silent. Isn't that messed up?
That's mad.
They said it's an offence to remain silent. So,
that's a classic example of two-tier policing. But to your previous point, it's the old adage: if you put black ants and red ants into a pot, they don't fight each other. But when you shake the pot, they begin fighting each other. So the question is, who's shaking the pot? Because that's the point. The more the pot is shaken, the more we fight each other. And that's really what's happening. But also we're seeing that within the kind of quote unquote freedom movement. And you're right, to go back to your other point, I've talked to Matthias Desmet about this idea of being awake, that you're a critical thinker. It's not necessarily a broad stroke characteristic that is applied to every single topic. And it's very difficult actually to do the depth. I mean, having done 1,000 episodes plus of the Pandemic podcast, I had to read on, the amount I've read and consumed over that time. And I confess, there were many times where I was looking to validate my own viewpoint. But over time, I kind of tried to zoom out and look at broader range of sources. But to do that on any given subject is almost impossible. So what people resort to doing is following the herd. So if the person you liked on subject A says that, you tend to either follow it or go gut instinct and then say, I don't like what they're saying. And then you start to call them a shill or something else because they violated your view on that thing. And that further fragments this very strong non-partisan movement. So I do genuinely believe the freedom movement itself that emerged during COVID was non-partisan. I mean, I worked with people across the left, the right, the up, the down. It didn't matter where you came from because we're actually unifying on something that was not actually partisan. It was not about, and you saw the issues. Every government in the world was enacting these policies, whether they were left-wing, right-wing, red, blue, socialist, communist, libertarian. It didn't matter.
There were no libertarian
there's no real libertarian parties, but there is more freedom-minded cultures and countries. People look to America as like the American dream, the land of the free. Yeah, where were those freedoms? And they are the most loud and vocal about their constitution.
And loads of them just stayed home because they were scared and didn't do anything about it.
And allowed that constitution to be trampled upon without question. So we have to really catch ourselves, which is why that point to come back to like localization, back to the human heart. We've got to work on ourselves. We've got to look at ourselves in the mirror and make sure that we damn well don't become what we're resisting. And it's very hard to resist a temptation when everything has become divided and amplified. We're in a constant state of fear and anxiety. Every story is deliberately created in a way to create a trigger point. And we human beings, we feel that trigger within us, and it creates that kind of moral outrage. But we've almost got to come back and settle ourselves down and say, okay, what's really happening here? What's really happening here? Because where is your head now looking? You're not looking at the target that you were looking at before, which is about creating the change that you want to see in the world. It's now about this next divide over here and this next divide, and it's done on a daily basis. Every 24 hours, there's a new thing.
Yeah. I think one of the ultimate ones was this one, there's a Manchester airport with the guy getting kicked in the head, right? And
But who's talking about that now? It's gone. It's like that every story. It's gone like a whistle in the wind.
Yeah.
But it's hype for like 24 hours, 48 hours.
And then Leeds riots. Was it Leeds or Leicester?
Which ones? I've lost track now.
You had the police come in, taking these kids away. Police routinely do this. We had a lady in today whose children were stolen from her. So you completely understand the anger that's coming through, right? But then you have a bunch of foreigners who are rioting and setting fire to something, right? So a bunch of people are outraged at these foreigners who are rioting and setting fire to things, which they shouldn't be doing. But then a bunch of other people are completely outraged that, the police are going around stealing children, and they say, oh, they're picking on the migrants. So this is a perfect way of people seeing two completely different sides of the picture. And really, they should be sitting there sort of condemning both. Apart from, of course, the burning of any police vehicles, which I do not condemn. but I do not encourage. I do not encourage.
Well, so,
I just do not condemn.
Right. So yeah. So well, here's where it gets interesting. Your point around the book about was it on war? You called it? Is it on war?
On killing.
On killing. So someone who's become quite close friend in the recent months, ex-military, gave me a really interesting first-hand insight into how the military operates and how groupthink is so deep. And I'm sure it's absolutely the same within the police force, in that, you know, it becomes completely dehumanized. It's your sense of self in the institution is eroded. Now, I'm not saying that that is a good thing or a right or the right thing, but it's a process that happens, and you will do things in the name of that organization, that entity that you, if in your own right, in your own sense of morality, would not condone.
Because it's considered a tribe, it's considered a family. Were you ever in the military?
No, I wasn't. No.
Okay, sorry. You just look jacked.
I've burnt myself out a few times in the last few years, so I'm trying to take better care of my health. So thanks for the compliment.
You know, in the army, I don't know if it's all regiments, but I knew a guy, and they do this thing, and they go, "What makes the grass grow?" They shout, "Blood, blood, blood." It's meant to hype them up. And look, I can on a level you can kind of understand it, but within the police, I think there are such serious issues. I've been talking with a few different people. I talked with Charles Mallet and other people about transforming the police from this body that is essentially now an illegal permanent standing army, because they've got arms that we can't have, which is ridiculous. If I can't have something as a weapon to defend myself, there's no way the government can have that just to do, you know, civil policing. That's civic policing. That's ridiculous. Because when we started out, obviously we could have whatever guns we liked, and they just had, you know, truncheons. So it's gone from, you know, us being at the top and then being down here to this complete imbalance, which I think is ridiculous. I was talking about moving to a system where you've got special constables making up 50% of the manpower. So on average, any 2 policemen you get, one of them will be a part-timer. He'll be, you know, a plumber or a teacher, or he'll work in Tesco's, right? Or he'll just be some sort of, you know, he could be an Uber driver or anything like that. But he gives 1 day a fortnight. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you can have lots and lots and lots of people doing this. Therefore, you've got whistleblowers, you've got outside perspectives, right? And yes, I do recognise you do need permanent people to say, yeah, I know this area, I know what's going on here. But do they need to be 100%, or do they really need to be more than 50% of your police force?
Well, I don't have a strong view on the subject, but other than that, it's another institution that needs deep reform and or rethinking, reimagining. But a lot of the principles that I hold true with government would also hold true in any other institution, which I would expect it to be decentralized, operate down to the lowest level of subsidiarity. It should be community-led. And your point around that kind of special constable, it means that you are bringing people in from the community. And where I grew up down in Devon, and you know, people knew Neil Stanlake, PC Neil Stanlake. Like, he was a community police officer. We didn't actually need a big police force, because people are now called. It's a classic. It's the same thing. We need more police. We need more government. We need more this, more that. It's like, well, actually, no. Slow down a minute. If we actually sort ourselves out a little bit here, we need less government and we need less police. But the more we outsource these things to institutions and organizations outside ourselves, the more we give away our own power. You know, people talk about, oh, the globalists and the elites, they've got such power over governments. It's like, yeah, but we've got less than 1% political membership in the UK. So the public have basically said, and I understand it, I completely agree, I couldn't align myself with any political party right now, but so they don't want to, so they've got this sense of apathy, and as a result, you know, it's left this giant wedge. So
people don't vote, and
they don't vote.
And I think that's a big problem, because a lot of people are looking for this sort of messiah-like figure, because they're, like we said, it's really fragmented.
Yeah.
They're looking for someone who's right on just about everything, right? I voted in the last election for reform, right? One thing I clearly do not agree with them at all on is their stop and search policy, because I don't believe that unless I meet the description of someone who's just committed a crime, I don't think the police should be laying their hands on me at all. Yeah. Right?
Well, your point here, this is where it gets really interesting, because your point, we're forced to vote for a party or a politician rather than an issue that we care about. You have to try and find a fit that best fits your unique set of characteristics. Democracy only works in self-interest, actually, interestingly, because if you vote in what you believe that the society needs or other people need, you're going to miscalculate it.
Yeah, because a group with in-group preference will destroy any other group, which is why you've got these, radicalized minorities who are now oppressing the majority of this country. But
well, you can get tyranny of the majority and you can get tyranny of the minority. But the same thing in COVID. Yeah. Tyranny of majority played out.
Tyranny is tyranny.
Tyranny is tyranny. It doesn't matter if it's big or large, it's big or small, it's still tyranny. Mm. So I think it comes back to how do we take greater responsibility in our day-to-day lives? That's, to me, that's why I always have hope, is because when you start to lean up against things that cause discomfort or outrage, or rather than just falling into the rage and the sense of frustration, you've got to look at what is it that's making me angry? What is it really? What's the root of this? And when you start to look at what the root of it is, there's all this anger in society right now. Yet, where is it really being directed consciously to say, well, what is the root cause of this problem, and how do we actually start to come together to explore at a community level how we change this? Because until we're able to do that, and until we can resolve some of the things within ourselves, we're just going to end up in the same situation where all that happens is we create more chaos creates more crisis creates more government, crisis creates more authoritarian leadership. So we have to harness that energy that's there right now. It's a transformational energy, because transformation requires chaos. Like creativity itself comes from a sense of chaos. And if we can do that by becoming a reflection of what we want to see in the world, which is why I understand the anger and things that are happening out there, but I call it the boomerang effect. If you want to get in a more angry world, you throw a boomerang of anger out, it's going to come back, and eventually it's going to hit you back on the head. Like you've got to really be in my view, we've got to start to be, and this is how I'm leading in my life right now. How do I embody the characteristics in my life so I can become a role model to myself, to my children, to my family, and my community? And how do I do that in a way that can inspire others to do the same? And that's very, very hard, because I'm subjected to the same triggers as everyone else. I turned all my Twitter notifications off today because I wake up in the morning and boom, it's bad news. Another thing, straight away, I start my day in moral outrage. I'm like, this is how I'm living my life now. Like, how do I live a great life? How do I become a role model if I live in permanent state of outrage? That this is how all these narratives that are guiding our society are born from. How do we start to create a new narrative about this type of society that we want to live in? How do we create something that is joyful, that is peaceful, that is prosperous? How do we create something that is free?
You talked about internal transformation.
Yes.
And I think that's great. And, I love what loads of different communities are doing around the country.
Yeah.
Like we've been down to Sounds Beautiful Festival. They're creating a community down in Dorset. We have people doing a cafe in Stroud. There are people all across this country doing little projects, right? I'm involved with Hope down in Sussex. We've got their festival coming up. But the problem is, I think Robert Heinlein, and he's a libertarian, he puts it like this: violence is the one supreme authority from which all other authority derives. So he says you can be, completely zen in and of yourself, but at the end of the day, the man with the gun is going to get his way, because if you say no to him, he will shoot you, or he will beat you over the head with a baton. He will throw you in a cell, and you can try and communicate your ideas to most people, but if most people are sheep, what if they just don't wake up? What if most people are just so indoctrinated? Because we've had this state schooling system for a century. Yeah. And, we are descended. Our ancestors overthrew and have killed many kings. In fact, we had a revolution in 1215. We had another rebellion after that. We've got rid of Richard II, Richard III. We've overthrown James II. And brought in William of Orange. We've got rid of king after king after king. We've had uprisings, revolutions. Even the one that was most peaceful under William of Orange still had violence in it. At what point do we need to be willing to fight an actual revolution in defense of our fundamental rights? Because if we live in a country where, I had a lady in, where the state will come and take your kids, they will kidnap your children, is that not simply a red line? And say, look, I'm not going to sit here and hold a placard. we must have a revolution. If this is what the government believes it can do, which is just kidnapping children for them to be raped in this system, when they're allowing these rape gangs to go, on the rampage all across the north and all other parts of the country too, right? Where people are being attacked for free speech, when half of your income is being eaten up by rent because they've got mass migration, and where we're going to be a minority in our own country within 50 years, within my lifetime, we're going to be a minority in our own country. So we will have no option at that point. At what point do you need to just have a revolution?
Well, there's many complex factors in there. So firstly, there's a couple of things I'll draw out that I think are important. And this is a reflection of a frustration I have. So again, it's pointing the problem to these authorities to solve. When are we going to overthrow this or that to replace it with what? Another form of what we've just had?
To remove, I would say, if I had my way, have a constitution, and I think I may be a little controversial here. I believe you cannot have a democracy without a jury. Mm-hmm. So I want to return to unanimous juries for conviction. I want to enshrine conscientious acquittal, and I want to enshrine our fundamental rights. If it's going to take 12 out of 12 of my peers to declare me guilty for something, that is the ultimate protection that I can have against government.
It's not flawless, though.
It's not flawless,
no.
But that is what kept our country stable. Ever since we've lost that, everything's fallen apart. If you want,
does it work at a grand scale though? Does it work at a grand jury level? Does it work at every level, do you think?
I would expand the power of jury. So I would say anything beyond a fine, right? And it would have to be, a fairly small fine, maybe in the hundreds, maybe even the low thousands. But anything beyond that, any form of incarceration.
Well, if your form of revolution is just to get a jury system in place, I think that's a very peaceful and simple revolution.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, whilst these people still have the mechanisms of the state behind them, whilst they control every single institution, there is no capacity to actually exercise this, because you can get 12 people together. You can try holding a jury, right? They will, and for someone who's committed some sort of crime, right, they will raid you, they will grab every single one of you, and they will throw you in a cell, and they'll put in a fake jury, right, where they only require, they only require 10 people to say you're guilty. And a bunch of them aren't even your peers, aren't even British.
I mean, it's so complicated. I may have agreed with you before COVID on this, but right now I've seen all it takes. If my innocence was down to a jury, it would only come down to who is the better, most compelling storyteller to influence that jury. Because how many legal cases have you watched where it's really won on the facts? It's one on who can make the most compelling case, and it's who can move a jury. And this isn't just American fictionalized law series. It's fact. It's so then it creates a situation where your representation is determining your future, not the jury.
Well, on representation, that's where we need to move to. We need to abolish all qualifications in order to practice law. Right, that is fundamental, and we need to move back to a system where, sure, if someone wants to offer a qualification, go do it, but where anyone, if they're like an expert on one very small narrow field, they can go do that. Do you know how much pressure that would take off? The costs are impossible. The level of
how as an end user. So, okay, we're going to spend an hour talking about the practical. I can wriggle with this one for a while. How would you then, if you had to select your legal representative and that qualification criteria had been removed, how do you, with the plethora of choices, select the best representation to you to get the best possible chance of your innocence being proven?
Well, within a free market, you're going to have different people with reviews. I mean,
true.
Look, even in a black market, look at the Silk Road.
And the problem is now, like, if I go to London today and I want to find somewhere for dinner after this event, I can find 2 5-star rated places, but they're completely different experiences. So it's like, how do you qualify? It's complex. All I'm saying, I suppose, is it's complex. And I don't disagree that the system needs reforming. We went from like violent revolution to quickly
But you asked what are you going to replace it
yes.
with, which is the right question to ask, which is why we need to now go into this, because that's the perfect question. Because whenever someone wants to have a revolution, whenever someone wants to overthrow a tyranny, my question to them is always that.
Yeah.
What are you going to replace it with? And most people, just about all people I ask, have no clue, in which case I'm not interested.
Yeah. Or it's always more of go to mum and dad. It's always like that same mentality of go to someone else, which is why I get, so there's a lot of injustice happening right now, but we're externalizing it all the time. We're not looking at our neighborhood and going, well, hang on a minute, where is this happening on a micro scale in our community? And what am I going to do about it? I mean, I've been part of a local group recently, and it's really interesting actually, because I'm part of lots of different freedom groups, but I joined a group called Bring Community Power, and its entire objective was to enhance the local community, you know, to clean up where it required cleaning up, to kind of look at how we can make use of derelict buildings, like all of these really smart things that we could do differently. And there's all these people saying, well, isn't that the council's job? Well, maybe on paper it is, but if we keep saying it's someone else's responsibility, who's going to take responsibility for your own, charity does begin at home. Like, first look after your home, first look after yourself, but then you've got to look outside your front door.
Yeah.
But people don't want the responsibility that comes with freedom. And that's where we end up in these authoritarian nanny states. So under these conditions, outrage comes up, and outrage will just generally, it needs releasing. It's important that we have that release, but at the same time, how it's released is important, but in my view. But all that follows, unless there is a clear alternative, is more of the same.
Yeah, because this is why we need to abolish the Department of Education, abolish the NHS, right? Abolish, international development and whatnot. Look, you can abolish most functions of government, and if you moved literally just back to justice first and foremost, and an armed forces to protect us from outside threats, then okay, you've got trouble with someone else. Go deal with that. Maybe you could also have someone deal with the roads and potholes, because that would make it so much easier, because we've got about 100 different issues to choose from. Take most of them constitutionally beyond the realm of government. So government cannot have any involvement. And then at least if we do have to have some form of representation, which you talked about direct democracy, loads of people talk to me about it. But the problem is,
direct democracy was something I was a deep advocate for prior to COVID. Tyranny of the majority. I've learned tyranny of the majority hurts in a very deep way. But I'd still look at things like Switzerland. You need to safeguard against either end of that spectrum: tyranny of the minority and tyranny of the majority. It's complex, but I believe it's possible. But I wouldn't want to throw the baby out of the bathwater. We have to first understand and test things. And what sometimes works on a local scale doesn't work on a grand scale. So it's really fascinating during this period in history. What we really need is more conversations like this to bring people together to actually explore what are alternatives, what have been tested, what can work. But my guiding message is to everyone at home right now: if you want things to change, you really have to look to yourself first, because if you aren't willing to do the work, then you're always outsourcing the work to someone else, and you're giving away your power. You're giving away your sovereignty if you aren't willing to be a participant in the process. And that, for me, is the enduring path to our transformation, is taking that commitment, taking the long road effectively, because the short road is always outsourcing it to someone else.
So tell me, what have you got coming up then?
Well, so I suppose if we were to distill all of this, coming up in September, in response to, in a way, the UN Summit of the Future, we've got the People's Reset on the 27th to the 29th in Bath at the Apex Hotel. 3 days. I partnered with Derek Bros and the Conscious Resistance and the Freedom Cell Network. They founded the Greater Reset in 2020 in response initially to the Great Reset. And they've been hosting summits, events, seminars all over the United States and Mexico since then, reaching tens of thousands of people across the world with this. And it caught my attention in 2020. I thought, I wish I could go to that. It was online at the time, but when they did their first event, I thought, I wish I could go to that. And I did go to that in Mexico this year, the first event. I had the privilege of speaking there, and my eyes were just opened. It was the first event I've been to in 4 years where the whole subject wasn't about COVID. There was no speakers talking about lockdowns. There was no speakers talking about governments. There was no speakers talking about vaccines and adverse reactions. It was 5 days of conversations about how we do these things differently, at an individual level and at a collective level, a systems level. Meaning, if we want to break from the grips of big pharma, how do we take better care of our health so we don't become dependent on the medical system? And if we do need treatment, or we need an intervention, what alternatives are available to us? So there's 5 different themes which encompass everything from education, finance, governance. The event is largely given, but predicated on voluntarist perspectives: community self-organization, free market principles, do no harm. There is the principles that surround the event I think are fitting for this time. But it was the first event that I went to where I was just, wow, this is literally, and the event is 5 days in Mexico. It's 3 days here in the UK for the first one. It's every single day immersion into these different pillars of things that we could do differently. So I left that event. I said, Derek, we have to bring this to Europe. Like, Europe is aching. By Europe, I mean, it's in America. We needed to bring it to the United Kingdom. We need to bring it to this part of the world.
Yeah, the EU doesn't have a monopoly on what Europe is.
No, it's right. We need to bring this to this part of the world. So we're doing it first in the United Kingdom this September, 3 days. And then undoubtedly, there's already people saying, let's bring it to Germany, Portugal, blah, blah, blah. It's gonna expand. But I think this has come at the right time. It's for those people who want to understand. The answer is, what can I do first? Because when people say, what can we do? What they're really saying is, what can other people do? We're going to change that. So it's, what can you do? Like, what can I do as an individual to start making a difference? And then how does that connect with the systems and structures that we're all part of? Because let's face it, all the systems and structures are as a reflection of the societal needs that we're in. So how do we start to shift our own needs, and how does that connect with the world around us? So that's coming up in September. We will do some form of resistance.
Which date?
27th to the 29th of September. We will do some form of resistance against the UN Summit of the Future and the Pact. What form that's going to take, I'm not sure yet.
And so, yeah, there'll be some sort of protest as well.
Possibly a protest in New York around that one. Working with some international partners on that to make that happen. Definitely some online, lots of stuff online in the build-up to help people become aware of it. Because every time I speak about the Summit of the Future, people's eyes go blank. It's like, well, this is the next biggest thing since the WHO's World Health Assembly, where they were looking at these key documents. This is really the power structures of today coming together to double down. And there's an entire section on the compact, the digital compact of the future, which is essentially squashing anything that challenges their worldview. So we've really got to start paying attention. But if all we do is pay attention to what they're doing and we don't pay attention to what we're doing, then nothing will ever change. So that's why we've got that resist and rebuild style mentality. We'll resist that summit, but the next week we're getting together to look at actually what journey are we going to go on to start to do things differently.
Beautiful. And where can people find you?
They can find me. You look up Dan Astin-Gregory all over the web. If you want to come to the summit, go to thegreaterreset.org.
Beautiful. And may I quickly ask, if you had to recommend 3 books, what would they be?
Oh, man. The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, quite frankly, that was being one of the most transformational books on my life. What am I reading right now? 3 books, wow. Start with that one and come back to me later.
Okay. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like, a share, a subscribe, hit the notification button if you would like to help. We've got a Patreon and a Subscribe Star, so please head on over there and pledge us some support if you want to keep this journalism going. We've got a professional studio here and we could do with your support to keep these great conversations coming. Okay, and quickly, word association. Freedom.
Life.
Tyranny.
Oppression.
Hope.
Optimism.
Music.
Joy.